A cold, rainy night in New York. On the steps of a bank, a woman in a worn coat, face hollow with despair, hands trembling as she held a paper that read, "Account frozen." No one recognized her as Clarissa Lane, the billionaire CEO who once ruled Lane Global. She collapsed onto the wet concrete, rain soaking through her clothes. A man in a janitor's uniform holding a mop stopped beside her. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her voice cold. "You think a janitor can help someone who just lost everything?" He smiled softly. "Maybe I can't save your company, but I can help you stand up." She stared at him, not knowing that this man was the reason she was still alive today. Clarissa Lane, 34 years old, former CEO, tech billionaire, known for being cold and ruthless. Daniel Hayes, 38 years old, single dad, janitor at the building that used to house Lane Global headquarters. Ella, 8 years old, Daniel's daughter, always asking, "Dad, why don't people look at janitors the same way?" Clarissa had been the definition of power, wealthy beyond measure, brilliant, someone who believed money could solve anything. Then came the deal that destroyed her, a trusted business partner, someone she considered a friend. He stole everything. The entire investment fund vanished overnight. The company collapsed within weeks. Shareholders turned their backs. The media tore her apart. Headlines called her reckless, incompetent, a fraud. Her assets were frozen. Her penthouse was seized. Her so-called friends stopped answering calls. She fled the city, wandering the streets alone at night, invisible in a way she'd never been before. One night, she found herself standing outside her old building, the place where she once commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions with a single word. The security guard didn't recognize her. "Sorry, ma'am. This area is closed. Only night cleaning crew allowed." She stepped back, rain-soaked and shaking. Unable to go anywhere else, she sat down on the cold stone steps, her head in her hands. That's when she heard footsteps. A man in a janitor's uniform walked past, then stopped. He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You'll get sick." She looked up at him, anger flashing in her eyes. "Who do you think you are to tell me what to do?" "Someone who knows what it feels like to lose everything." "You? You know nothing about loss." His voice was calm. "My wife died 3 years ago. Lost my house, lost my career. Now I mop floors, but at least my daughter still smiles." Clarissa fell silent. He didn't wait for a response. He just nodded and walked back inside to finish his shift. She sat there for another hour, his jacket still around her shoulders, warmer than anything she'd owned in her mansion. The next morning she returned. Not because she had anywhere else to go, but because something about that man unsettled her. She found him in the lobby, cleaning the glass doors. "I wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "You don't need to. Do you know who I am?" "No, but I'm guessing you used to be someone important." "Very important." He smiled. "Then maybe now you can finally see people like me." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She stood there speechless as he continued wiping the glass. "I need a job," she said suddenly. He stopped, looked at her. "You serious?" "I have nothing, no money, no home. I need to eat." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll talk to the supervisor. We need extra hands for the night shift." 2 days later, Clarissa Lane, former Billionaire CEO, was holding a mop for the first time in her life. The other workers stared. Some whispered, a few laughed. "She doesn't even know how to hold it right." Daniel walked over. "You're gripping it too tight. You're not fighting it. You're guiding it." She looked at him, frustrated. "This is humiliating." "No," he said gently. "Humiliating is when you stop trying." That first night was the hardest. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. She wanted to quit 100 times, but every time she looked at Daniel, working quietly, efficiently, with dignity, she kept going. At 3 a.m., they took a break. He offered her half of his sandwich. "I can't take your food," she said. "You haven't eaten all day, I can tell." She took it, and for the first time in months, she cried, not because she was hungry, but because someone cared. Over the next few days, she watched him, the way he worked, The way he treated everyone the same, rich or poor, executive or janitor. One evening, as they were emptying trash bins on the 10th floor, she asked, "Why are you so kind to everyone?" He paused. "Because when you have nothing left, the only thing that still belongs to you is how you treat people." She thought about that all night. The penthouse she lost, the cars, the designer clothes, the private jet. None of it had made her kind. By the end of the week, something inside her had shifted. She started arriving early, staying late. Not because she had to, but because for the first time in her life, she felt like she was doing something that mattered, even if it was just making sure the floors were clean so people wouldn't slip. A security guard later said, "He didn't know who she was, didn't care. He just saw a person shaking in the rain, put his jacket on her shoulders and went right back to work like it was nothing." 3 weeks into the job, Clarissa was no longer the clumsy beginner who couldn't hold a mop properly. Her hands had stopped blistering. Her back had adjusted to the long hours. She could clean an entire floor in half the time it took her at first. But more than that, she had started to notice things. The way people walked past janitors without making eye contact. The way executives dropped trash on the floor, assuming someone else would pick it up. The way she used to do the exact same thing. One night, as they were cleaning the executive suite on the 20th floor, Clarissa stopped in front of a massive corner office. Her old office. Daniel noticed her staring. "You used to work here?" "I owned this floor," she said quietly. He didn't look surprised. "I thought so. You clean like someone who's angry at the dirt." She laughed, a bitter sound. "I'm angry at myself." "Why?" "Because I was blind. I walked these halls for 10 years and never once looked at the people cleaning them." Daniel set down his bucket. "You're looking now. That's what matters." She turned to him. "How do you do it? Stay kind after everything you've lost?" He smiled. "My daughter, Ella. She keeps me honest." "How?" "She asks questions I can't lie my way out of. Like, why do people ignore us? Why do they act like we're invisible?" Clarissa felt a knot in her throat. "What do you tell her?" "I tell her that people only see what they're taught to see, and that our job is to be so kind they can't ignore us anymore." The next evening, Daniel brought Ella to work. It was a weekend, and his babysitter had canceled. Clarissa watched as the little girl sat in the break room, coloring in a notebook. "Hi," Clarissa said, sitting down beside her. Ella looked up, her eyes bright. "Are you my dad's friend?" "I think so. Is that okay?" "Yes. Dad needs more friends. He's always sad when he thinks I'm not looking." Clarissa's chest tightened. "He loves you very much." "I know. That's why I try to be good. So he doesn't have to be sad." Clarissa couldn't speak. This 8-year-old child understood something she had spent her entire life ignoring. That love wasn't about what you could buy. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice. Later that night, after Ella had fallen asleep on the break room couch, Clarissa and Daniel sat together in the lobby, eating vending machine snacks. "Can I ask you something?" Clarissa said. "Sure." "If you could go back, to before you lost everything, would you?" Daniel thought for a long moment. "No." "Why not?" "Because back then, I had money, a big house, a career I thought defined me, but I was always chasing more. I never stopped to just be." He paused, looking at his daughter sleeping in the other room. "Now I have less, but I'm more." Clarissa felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't know if I can ever get to where you are." "You're already closer than you think." Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. They started talking more. About life, about regrets, about the strange beauty of starting over. Clarissa told him about the betrayal, how her business partner had stolen everything, how she had trusted the wrong person. Daniel told her about his wife, how she died in a car accident, how he had to explain to Ella that mommy wasn't coming home. "I blamed myself for a long time," he said. "Thought if I'd just driven that day instead of her, she'd still be here." "That's not your fault," Clarissa said. "I know, but guilt doesn't listen to logic." One night they were cleaning the cafeteria when Clarissa found an old newspaper someone had left behind. The headline read, "Lane Global sold for parts. Former CEO vanishes." She stared at it, her hands shaking. Daniel saw it, walked over. took the paper from her hands and threw it in the trash. That's not who you are anymore. Then who am I? Someone who shows up, someone who works hard, someone who's learning to see people. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. Why do you believe in me? Because you're still here. You didn't run. You didn't give up. You chose to start over. That takes more strength than building an empire. For the first time since losing everything, Clarissa felt something she thought was gone forever. Hope. A few days later, she did something she hadn't done in months. She made coffee for the entire cleaning crew. It was a small gesture. But when she handed cups to each person and said their names, she saw their faces light up. One woman, Mariah, looked at her with tears in her eyes. You remembered my name. Of course, Clarissa said. Most people don't. Clarissa hugged her and realized that this moment was worth more than any boardroom deal she'd ever closed. That night, Daniel found her sitting on the steps outside, staring at the city lights. You okay? He asked. I think I'm starting to understand. Understand what? That I didn't lose everything. I just lost the things that didn't matter. He sat down beside her. Took me 2 years to figure that out. You're faster than me. She smiled. I had a good teacher. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city breathe. For the first time in her life, Clarissa Lane felt rich. A cleaning crew member later said, she used to yell at staff for being too loud. Now she makes coffee for everyone and knows all our names. That janitor changed her. We all saw it. 2 months into working together, Clarissa collapsed in the storage room during the night shift, her body giving out from exhaustion and malnutrition she'd been hiding for weeks. Daniel found her unconscious on the concrete floor, her pulse weak, her skin pale and cold. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his arms and carried her 6 blocks to the nearest emergency room because calling an ambulance would have cost money he knew she didn't have. The hospital staff rushed her into a room while Daniel sat in the waiting area, his janitor uniform still damp from the rain outside, his hands shaking as he filled out the forms with what little information he knew about her. When the doctor came out 2 hours later, she told him Clarissa was stable but severely malnourished and dehydrated. She needed rest and proper meals, and she asked if he was family. Daniel said no, just a friend, but the doctor handed him Clarissa's medical records anyway to sign the release forms. That's when he saw it, the full name printed at the top of the page. Clarissa Ann Lane, born March 15, 1991, previous address listed as Boston, Massachusetts. His hands froze, the clipboard nearly slipping from his grip. Because that name, that city, that year, it all connected to a memory he'd buried deep for 17 years. When Clarissa woke up in the hospital bed, her vision blurry and her head pounding, she saw Daniel sitting in the chair beside her, his head in his hands. And when he looked up at her, his eyes were filled with something she couldn't name. You're from Boston, he said quietly. And it wasn't a question. She blinked, confused. Yes, I went to college there. Why, how do you know that? He leaned forward, his voice careful. Do you remember the fire? The one in the dorm building in the 2008? Her breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively moving to her chest. The fire, yes, I was trapped on the 3rd floor. I thought I was going to die. Daniel nodded slowly. There was smoke everywhere. The alarms were screaming, and you were in the corner of your room, unconscious, and someone pulled you out. Clarissa's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. A man? I never saw his face. He just grabbed me and dragged me down the stairs. I woke up outside on the grass and he was gone. I looked for him for months, but no one knew who he was. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out an old faded photograph, creased and worn from being carried for years, and he handed it to her. It was a picture of a young woman lying on the grass, her face covered in soot, a butterfly necklace around her neck, and in the background, barely visible, a young man walking away. That's you, Daniel said, and that's me. Clarissa stared at the photo, her hands trembling. Then she reached up and touched the butterfly necklace she still wore, the one she'd never taken off since that night. It was you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You saved me. Why didn't you ever say anything? Daniel's voice cracked. because I didn't need you to know. I just needed you to live." She sobbed, the weight of 17 years crashing down on her. "I spent years trying to find you. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to tell you that you gave me a second chance." He smiled sadly. "And you used it well. You built an empire. You became powerful." She shook her head violently. "No, I became blind. I became cruel. I forgot what it meant to be human. You saved me from the fire, but I lost myself anyway." Daniel took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Then maybe I'm saving you again." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same kindness in his eyes that had been there 17 years ago when he pulled her from the flames without asking for anything in return. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why do you keep saving me when I've done nothing to deserve it?" He squeezed her hand. "Because kindness isn't about what people deserve. It's about what we choose to give." She cried harder, her shoulders shaking. "I treated people like you as invisible. I walked past janitors and cleaners and security guards like they were furniture. And you're the reason I'm alive. And I didn't even see you." Daniel wiped her tears with his thumb. "But you see me now, and that's what matters. You're not the same person you were 2 months ago. You're not even the same person you were 17 years ago." She gripped his hand tighter. "How can you forgive me? How can you still be kind to me after everything?" He smiled, the same soft smile he'd given her that rainy night on the steps. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and forget who you are. My wife died, and I became a ghost for 2 years. I stopped caring about anything except survival. But then Ella asked me one day, 'Daddy, are you still a good person?' And I realized I had a choice, to stay broken or to rebuild myself into someone she could be proud of." Clarissa's heart shattered and healed at the same time. "You didn't just save my life twice. You showed me what it means to be alive." Daniel stood up, pulling her into a gentle hug. "And you showed me that kindness isn't wasted, even when people don't see it right away." They held each other in that sterile hospital room, two broken people who had found each other twice across 17 years. And for the first time since losing everything, Clarissa understood that she hadn't lost what mattered. She'd just been looking in the wrong place. A nurse who witnessed the moment later said, "She held his hand and said, 'Thank you for saving me twice.' And he just smiled and said, 'Thank you for making me believe that kindness is never wasted.' I've never seen two people cry that hard and smile that much at the same time." After 3 days in the hospital, Clarissa was released with strict orders to eat regularly and rest. But rest wasn't what she needed. She needed purpose. She needed to prove that the second chance Daniel had given her 17 years ago and again 2 months ago wasn't going to be wasted. She had $500 left from her last paycheck as a janitor, money she'd saved by skipping meals, and instead of spending it on herself, she decided to do something she'd never done before, something that terrified and excited her at the same time. She rented a tiny space in a rundown neighborhood where factory workers and cleaners lived, a place she would have never stepped foot in during her billionaire days. And she started building something new. Not an empire, not a corporation, just a small coffee shop where people who were invisible could finally be seen. Daniel helped her every evening after their shifts, painting walls that were cracked and stained, fixing tables that wobbled, installing lights that flickered but still worked, and Ella would sit in the corner doing her homework, occasionally looking up to say things like, "Dad, this place is going to be beautiful." And Daniel would smile and say, "It already is." One night while they were painting the back wall a deep blue color that Ella had chosen, Clarissa turned to Daniel and said, "I used to think power came from how much money you had, how many people feared you, how high your office was in the building. But now I realize that real power is this, the ability to lift someone up when they're down, the choice to see people when the world tells you to look away." Daniel dipped his brush in the paint and said, "You didn't learn that from me. You learned it from yourself. I just reminded you it was there." She shook her head. "No, you showed me what it looks like to live with dignity when you have nothing. You showed me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the hardest and bravest thing a person can do." He paused, looking at her with those same gentle eyes that had pulled her from the fire. "And you showed me that people can change, that the person you were doesn't have to be the person you are." They worked in silence for a while. the sound of brushes against the wall, the smell of fresh paint. Ella humming a song in the background, and Clarissa felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the kind of peace that comes from having everything, but the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. 2 weeks later, the coffee shop was ready, the walls were painted, the tables were steady, the lights worked, and Clarissa stood in the middle of the empty room holding a handmade sign that read, "The Second Chance Cafe, where everyone gets another shot." Daniel walked in carrying a box of mugs they'd bought from a thrift store, each one mismatched and chipped but still usable, and he said, "You really want to call it that?" She nodded. "Because that's what you gave me, a second chance. And I want to give that to everyone who walks through this door." Ella ran up and hugged Clarissa's legs. "Can I work here too? I want to help people get second chances." Clarissa knelt down, tears in her eyes. "You already do, sweetheart, every single day." On opening day, the cafe was packed, not with wealthy executives or socialites, but with janitors and bus drivers and factory workers and single parents, people who had been overlooked and underestimated their entire lives. And Clarissa served every single one of them herself, learning their names, hearing their stories, giving free coffee to those who couldn't afford it. Daniel worked beside her, cleaning tables, restocking supplies, making sure everyone felt welcome. And at the end of the night, when the last customer left, Clarissa locked the door and turned to him. "I was wrong about everything. Wealth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in moments like this. In people who show up, in kindness that costs nothing but means everything." He smiled. "Took you long enough to figure it out." She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. Better late than never. And as they stood in that small coffee shop, with its mismatched mugs and chipped tables, and walls painted by people who cared, Clarissa realized that she had finally found what she'd been searching for her entire life. Not success, not power, not recognition, but meaning, the kind that can't be bought or stolen or lost, the kind that lives in the spaces between people when they choose to see each other as human. From today, I choose to look at people a little longer, to see them not as roles but as souls, to remember that kindness is the only currency that never loses value. I will live with kindness. 1 year later, the Second Chance Cafe had become more than just a coffee shop. It had become a movement, a place where people who had lost everything came to find hope, where the homeless could get a free meal, where ex-convicts could get job training, where single parents could bring their kids while they worked. And at the center of it all was Clarissa Lane, no longer the cold billionaire in designer suits, but a woman in a simple apron who knew every customer's name and story. Daniel still worked there, not as a janitor anymore, but as Clarissa's partner, managing the day-to-day operations, teaching new hires, making sure everyone who walked through the door felt seen. And Ella, now 9 years old, had her own little corner where she did homework and helped serve cookies to customers, always with that bright smile that reminded everyone why they kept coming back. One morning, a journalist from a major newspaper showed up, wanting to do a story on the former billionaire who had disappeared and resurfaced as a cafe owner. And when she sat down across from Clarissa with her recorder and notebook, she asked the question everyone wanted to know. "You were worth over $2 billion? You had private jets and penthouse apartments and a company that controlled markets? Now you own a small cafe in a working-class neighborhood? Do you regret losing everything?" Clarissa looked at Daniel, who was wiping down tables, then at Ella, who was helping an elderly man with his coffee, and she smiled. "I didn't lose everything. I lost money, and money was the only thing keeping me from seeing what actually mattered." The journalist leaned forward. "But don't you miss the power, the influence, the ability to change things on a massive scale?" Clarissa shook her head. "I changed more lives here in one day than I did in 10 years as a CEO. Back then, I moved money around. Now I move hearts. Back then, people feared me. Now people trust me. That's not a downgrade. That's an upgrade." The journalist scribbled notes furiously. "And what about the man, Daniel, the janitor who helped you? What role does he play in all this?" Clarissa's eyes softened. "He's not just the man who helped me. He's the man who saved my life twice, once from a fire 17 years ago, and once from myself 2 months ago. He taught me that dignity doesn't come from your bank account. It comes from how you treat people when you have nothing to gain. The article came out the following week with the headline, "The Billionaire Who Lost Everything and Found What Money Can't Buy." And it went viral. Millions of people read it, shared it, commented on it, and suddenly the Second Chance Cafe was flooded with visitors. Some came out of curiosity, others came because they needed hope. But everyone who left said the same thing, that they felt different, lighter, more human. One evening after closing, Clarissa, Daniel, and Ella sat together at one of the mismatched tables, exhausted but happy, and Ella looked up at Clarissa and said, "Miss Clarissa, my dad told me you used to be really rich." Clarissa nodded. "I was, sweetheart." Ella tilted her head. "Are you sad you're not rich anymore?" Clarissa looked at Daniel, then back at Ella, and she said, "I'm richer now than I ever was, because now I have people who care about me, not for what I can give them, but for who I am. And that kind of wealth can never be frozen or stolen or lost." Ella smiled. "Then you're the richest person I know." Daniel reached across the table and took Clarissa's hand, and in that moment, surrounded by chipped mugs and painted walls and the smell of coffee that had become home, Clarissa understood that she hadn't fallen from the top. She had climbed to a place she never knew existed, a place where love and purpose and human connection were the only currencies that mattered. And for the first time in her entire life, she was truly, completely, abundantly wealthy. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to My Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten, because sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who save us.